Land and environmental rules reshaping global portfolios. Something has shifted in how environmental regulation is landing on global businesses. And it is not just that the rules are getting stricter. Most executive teams already know that. What is catching companies off guard is how differently those rules are tightening depending on where you operate, and what that divergence is doing to portfolio assumptions that were built on a steadier regulatory floor. Land use restrictions, permitting timelines, biodiversity requirements, and environmental liability standards are all moving. But they are moving at different speeds, with different priorities, and under very different enforcement cultures across the markets that matter most. That inconsistency is harder to manage than simple tightening would be, and it is creating risk that existing compliance frameworks were not designed to catch. Divergence is the problem, not just direction. Europe is the clearest example of coordinated regulatory movement. The EU Nature Restoration Law, in force since 2024, changed the planning environment for industrial land development across member states in ways that many operational teams are still working through. Biodiversity obligations, supply chain accountability requirements, and land use disclosure frameworks are advancing together, and the compliance surface is wider than most companies initially assumed. The United States looks nothing like that picture. Federal scope has narrowed in certain areas, while individual states have moved in opposite directions from each other, creating a situation where similar assets in different states face meaningfully different permitting requirements and timelines. A project that moves smoothly through the approval process in one jurisdiction can sit for years in another, not because the underlying environmental conditions are different, but because the regulatory posture is. Emerging markets add a third dimension. New environmental safeguards are being introduced across parts of Asia Pacific, Latin America, and Africa, but enforcement predictability varies enormously. The gap between what the regulation says and how it is actually applied can be wide, and it shifts in ways that are genuinely difficult to anticipate from headquarters. The result for global portfolios is that regulatory assumptions built at the enterprise level are increasingly disconnected from conditions on the ground. Permitting timelines that informed capital models may bear little resemblance to what projects are actually encountering. Compliance costs that looked comparable across regions are diverging, and the risk is harder to price because it is not moving in one direction cleanly enough to model. Land is quietly becoming a gating factor. There is a generation of capital planning that treated land as a logistical input. You identified where you needed to operate, secured the site, and moved forward. That process has gotten genuinely more complicated in a relatively short period of time. Environmental reviews are broader and longer than they used to be, particularly for projects near wetlands, forests, or areas carrying biodiversity designations. Protected area classifications are expanding. Community opposition to industrial land use has become a more organized and legally sophisticated force in many markets. And the competition for available land has intensified in ways that were not fully anticipated, with energy infrastructure, data centers, agricultural use, and conservation priorities all drawing from the same constrained base. Research from the United Nations puts land degradation costs at roughly 10 to 17% of annual global GDP in lost ecosystem services. Governments are responding to that, and the regulatory responses are not going to ease. The developable land that exists today in key industrial corridors and growth markets is not going to get easier to access. For growth strategies that depend on it, that is a structural constraint worth taking seriously at the planning stage rather than discovering during execution. It is showing up in asset values. Now, the financial community has been anticipating the moment when physical environmental risk would show up in asset valuations rather than just sustainability disclosures. That moment is arriving. Facilities that cannot get expansion permits or that face new operational restrictions tied to land or water conditions are carrying forward-looking cash flow profiles that no longer match their original valuations. Projects in high-friction jurisdictions are being re-examined once realistic timelines and compliance costs get folded into the return analysis. Insurers and lenders are paying closer attention to environmental exposure, particularly around water availability and land stability, and that attention is beginning to affect underwriting decisions and financing terms in concrete ways. Environmental constraints have moved into the financial performance column. They are not footnotes to the investment thesis anymore. Supply chains are carrying more of this risk than most teams realize. Owned assets are one part of the picture, but the land and environmental risk sitting inside supply chains tends to be underweighted until something goes wrong. Agricultural sourcing is being reshaped by deforestation regulations in key production regions. Materials extraction faces tightening permitting requirements and community scrutiny that is affecting costs and timelines. Infrastructure bottlenecks tied to land access issues are creating delays that move upstream fast. A 2024 CDP report found that companies report environmental risks in their supply chains at rates significantly higher than what they report in their own operations. That gap is not a data point to note and set aside. It is unpriced exposure sitting inside current business performance. The timing matters more than most plans account for. For many organizations are in the middle of multi-year capital cycles right now, committing to energy transition investments, digital infrastructure build-out, and supply chain restructuring. These cycles carry execution assumptions about permitting, land access, and regulatory conditions that the current environment does not fully support. The decisions being made in the next 1 to 2 years about where to build, where to expand, and where to source will be shaped by regulatory trajectories that have not finished moving. Waiting for more clarity is a reasonable sounding position, but it is still a risk decision. It just moves the consequence later when options are narrower and the cost of adjusting is higher. Mapping assets against where regulation is heading rather than where it currently sits, building realistic permitting timelines into capital models, and extending environmental risk visibility into supply chain sourcing are not advanced practices at this point. They are the baseline for managing a portfolio environment that has changed. The companies that recognize land and environmental constraints as a capital strategy issue rather than a compliance category will make better decisions about where to deploy resources over the next several years. The ones still managing it as a legal and regulatory function sitting apart from strategic planning will find it surfacing as a financial issue at the moments when that is hardest to absorb. You've been listening to Sustainability Soundbites by Environment and Energy Leader. For partnership opportunities, please reach out to our team.